Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to the Trobe Law School International Comparative Law Cluster's annual lecture. My name is Maria Elander, and I am the Associate Dean of Research and Industry Engagement at the Trobe Law School. And together with my colleague, Professor Luisa Slava, I lead the International and Comparative Law Cluster. So I have the honor and the privilege of starting the proceedings tonight, and I do so by acknowledging that they're taking place on lands of the Wurundjeri and Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. These lands have not been ceded, and instead there have been thousands of years of legal work by the Wurundjeri and Wurrung peoples on these lands. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and future, and extend that respect to any Indigenous person who might be in this room here tonight. So, tonight's proceedings will proceed as follows. In a second, I will hand over the microphone to the Trobe University Vice-Chancellor, Professor Theo Farrell, who will give some context to tonight's lecture. He will then hand over to the Trobe Law School Dean, Professor Ben Saul, who will present our speaker, United Nations Special Rapporteur for Countering Terrorism and Human Rights, Professor Ben Saul. Professor Saul will speak for approximately 45 minutes, after which there will be time for some questions, which will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Luisa Slava. You can ask questions via Slido, the QR code for which you'll have at the back of the program, and which will be on the lecture screen in a second. So organizing an event like this does not take place without the support and hard work of a lot of people. And so I want to express my gratitude and thanks to the ongoing support by Vice-Chancellor Theo Farrell, Law School Dean, Professor Ben, the fantastic admin team that we have at the Trobe Law School, and in particular for tonight's proceedings, PhD candidate Andrea Aguirre-Panagua, who has done enormous work on making this happen. So thank you. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Trobe University Vice-Chancellor, Professor Theo Farrell.
Thanks very much, Maria, and good evening, everyone. I just want to start by also joining Maria in acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land of which we're meeting, paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any First Nations folks that are with us here this evening. So I'm delighted to be here for the second of 3 annual lectures with UN Special Rapporteurs presented by the Trobe Law School's International Comparative Law Cluster. And I also would like to join Maria in welcoming Professor Ben Saul this evening. And it's a great honor to have you here, Ben. Also want to say thank you, because I know you've been out to our campus in the door today, spending time with staff and students. And I'm sure they would have gotten an awful lot out of it, actually. It's an interesting, we live in interesting times, and when it comes to international law, that's doubly true. It's a very interesting time to be interested in international law. Established rules and norms for relations between states are being tested across multiple domains, from diplomacy, conflict, and the use of force, to economic and trade relations, environmental protection, and human rights. And so it's going to be particularly interesting to hear Professor Saul discuss these challenges and the ways in which international law and its supporting institutions might be strengthened in the face of rogue actors and states and certain presidents of certain states. So the Trobe Law School is pleased to be presenting these kinds of discussions, and it's one reason why, and one of the things I'm really proud about our law school is its strength in international comparative law. It's never been more important that we look out beyond the borders of our country, the shores of our country, to understand what's happening in the world and our role to shape things for the better. The law school has a strong tradition of socio-legal research and plays a big part in our mission as a university to make a difference to the communities that we serve. And the International Law and Comparative Law Cluster is amplifying this mission by providing a platform for research into international comparative law, by examining the role of international law in shaping the global order and trying to drive positive change. And more importantly, in building relationships with a global outlook and developing solutions for issues that societies are facing around the world. The cluster's research spans refugee law, international criminal law, international human rights law, public international law, and international economic law, and addresses concerns related to gender, conflict, climate change, and inequalities. So just basically the full gamut. It's a great demonstration, I think, of our university's mission. So we are a university where inclusion and innovation drive real-world impact. That's what we're focused on. And I think the work of the International Comparative Law Cluster absolutely demonstrates that. And we have a very global outlook in what we're seeking to do. So we're seeking to have make a positive difference to our communities here in Victoria and in Australia. But of course, as we know, really, in order to make positive change, we have to look globally. And that's one of the reasons why I'm particularly proud of work that we do towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That we're 20th globally and first in Australia for our work around SDG 2, Zero Hunger. And we're in the top 50 for our work on SDG 3, Health and Wellbeing, and SDG 5, Equality, Gender Equality. So I'm really proud of the work that we do here in the university, as indeed many universities across Australia, in trying to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think in that respect, it's really important that we have a very vibrant group in comparative and international comparative law. I just discovered, I had such a busy day, I've been running around with my hair on fire, and then I discovered the title of tonight's lecture, and my hair being on fire is not important at all. What's important is a world on fire. So I'm actually just really itching to get into what Ben is going to be discussing this evening. I'm sure it's going to be a very thoughtful lecture. It's going to spark a lot of ideas and debates, and I'm really looking forward to getting to that. And so with that in mind, stop talking and hand over to Lauren and get things going.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight for the second annual International Comparative Law Cluster lecture at the Trobe Law School. It's really exciting to be here with you this evening, to see such a great turnout of students, staff, and just members of the community, and even academics from other institutions. Now, I want to just speak a little bit about the role of Special Rapporteur. The origins of this mandate can be traced to 1967, when the United Nations Commission on Human Rights established an ad hoc working group of experts to investigate human rights abuses in Southern Africa. And that was the first in what became known as the Special Procedures. In 1975, the Commission created another working group to investigate human rights in Chile following the coup of 1973. And in 1979, that group was replaced by a special rapporteur who was assisted by two other experts to report on Chile, including the fate of disappeared persons. This was the first time the United Nations entrusted an individual mandate holder with the title of Special Rapporteur. From there, the system expanded to cover both countries and themes. One of the earliest thematic mandates was created in 1982, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary or Arbitrary Executions. Today, Special Rapporteurs are appointed by the Human Rights Council, which replaced the Commission in 2006. They serve in a personal capacity, independent of governments. Their role is to investigate, report, and make recommendations without fear or favor. That independence is what gives their work its moral authority. Now, the institution of the Special Rapporteur has long been of interest to me, might be a surprise to some of you. One of my very first academic articles, published in the Human Rights Law Review, examined the mandate on judicial independence. I just revisited it a couple nights ago, and it was very refreshing to see that some of the themes continue to resonate from that article so long ago. And this includes the difficulties of defining legal political concepts, the tension between universal standards and local legal cultures and institutions that have their own histories and contexts. It also engaged with the challenge of looking beyond formal rules sometimes to see informal norms that shape how institutions are understood and function. And for me, those reflections of that article that I had put together a long time ago underscore the complexity of international law's engagement with domestic systems and the critical role of the Special Rapporteur in navigating those tensions with principle and pragmatism. It is therefore a great privilege tonight to introduce to you Professor Ben Saul, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Because, as a side note, in 2024, The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was renamed to the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. You now have the officially longest title of any Special Rapporteur. That's very impressive. Congratulations. Professor Saul took up his mandate in November of 2023. He holds the Chalice Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney. He's a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences here in Australia, holds a doctorate in law from the University of Oxford, honours degrees in arts and law from the University of Sydney. Professor Saul has taught at a number of institutions, Harvard, Oxford, the Hague Academy of International Law, just to name a few. He has undertaken missions on behalf of international organizations in dozens of countries around the world. Now, I will not even begin to attempt to name the numerous books and more than 100 refereed articles that he has published so far in his stellar academic career, but I do just want to note the title of a number of leading books. So, Defining Terrorism in International Law, the Oxford Commentary on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Research Handbook on International Law and Terrorism, the Oxford Guide to International Humanitarian Law, and the Oxford Handbook on International Law in Asia and the Pacific. Beyond his academic achievements, Professor Saul has advised governments, parliaments, militaries, intelligence services, non-governmental organizations, and he has practiced before both national and international courts. Tonight, Professor Saul will speak on World on Fire. Is the rules-based international order disintegrating? And what does it mean for Australia? International law is under mounting pressure from Israel, Palestine to Ukraine, Sudan, and Myanmar. Conflict and impunity are on the rise, while international institutions face crisis. The United Nations is paralyzed. Court rulings go unenforced, and powerful states apply the law selectively, invoking it when it's convenient for them and ignoring it when it isn't. This lecture examines these challenges and asks how countries like Australia can help restore international law's credibility. Despite its flaws, international law has resilience, and it has shown that resilience, but to fulfill its ultimate promise of peace, justice, and human rights, we must demand less selectivity, more accountability, and be willing to look in the mirror ourselves. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ben Saul to deliver the 2025 annual lecture of the International Comparative Law Cluster.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me with this microphone. Perfect. I also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples. It's my honour to be invited to give the lecture tonight. My thanks to the International and Comparative, Law Cluster, and in particular to Luis and Maria and Andrea, who's done so much administrative work. Vice-Chancellor, delighted to see you, and thanks so much for your giving your support to tonight's lecture as well. And of course, the Dean, delighted to see you here as well. As Special Rapporteur, I have the privilege of engaging with 193 governments, the United Nations, and civil society worldwide to promote human rights while countering terrorism. And I've had a front row seat over the last 2 years to the geopolitical changes that are rocking our world. The global outlook for peace, human rights, and peaceful dispute settlement feel particularly bleak at the moment. Diplomacy and peacemaking seem unable to staunch the bloodshed in major conflicts. Impunity reigns for human rights violations, and world court judgments are routinely ignored. This year celebrates the United Nations' 80th anniversary, a time when peaceful multilateral cooperation on common human problems is more needed than ever, and yet the United Nations is under constant attack and is being decimated by a financial crisis. International law seems at a tipping point, ravaged by rule breakers, eroded by selectivity and double standards, and neglect from its friends, and in danger of regressing to the law of the jungle. We seem at a new low point or dark age in the post-war order, perhaps the mid but not quite late 1930s. Yet it's never too late. International law has often been battered over its 500-odd year history, but it is surprisingly resilient after cyclical downturns. After every existential crisis that threatens or breaks the international order, countries optimistically return to international law, since, for all its faults, it offers the possibility of principled and stable international relations rather than transactional politics, gunboat diplomacy, or new forms of colonial domination. Tonight, I'd like to talk about some current challenges as well as signs of hope in the international legal order, with a focus on contrasting the conflicts in Ukraine and Russia on the one hand, and Israel and Palestine on the other. Firstly, to Ukraine. Russia's full-throttle invasion of Ukraine is so shocking because it is such a brazen assault on the post-1945 world order, an attempt to extinguish and cannibalize an independent neighbouring country. A permanent member of the UN Security Council responsible for maintaining world peace under the UN Charter is seeking to rebuild an empire using indiscriminate and lawless force. It's tempting to view Russia's aggression as a death knell of the international ban on war and a return to the pre-modern law of the jungle. Now, in historical perspective, that view is too pessimistic. Russia's aggression is a rare exception to the rule against war that holds fast in most places, most of the time, occasional crises notwithstanding. The influential realist Hans Morgenthau acknowledged that compliance with international law is the norm, even though law has ultimate political limits. I quote, "The great majority of rules of international law are generally unaffected by the weakness of its system of enforcement, for voluntary compliance prevents the problem of enforcement from arising altogether. The problem of enforcement becomes acute, however, in that minority of important and generally spectacular cases in which compliance and its enforcement have a direct bearing upon the relative power of the nations concerned. In those cases, considerations of power rather than of law determine compliance and enforcement." Now, international wars occurred on average every year from the Middle Ages through to 1945. For many centuries, war was a common and lawful tool, whether for colonising land or seizing resources, enslaving peoples, punishing enemies, or inflicting religious dogma. Now, international wars are very rare. In part, this is why they are so confronting when they occur. The world, now a relatively stable community of 193 independent countries, is no longer a shifting mosaic of empires and colonies. War was first outlawed as an instrument of foreign policy by the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, but it failed to stem the fascist and militarist aggression that consumed the globe during the Second World War. A more comprehensive ban was placed at the heart of the United Nations Charter in 1945, with the exception of national self-defense or Security Council authorization of force, after a truly global war that killed, perhaps nobody really knows, 60 to 80 million people, about 50 million of whom were civilians. This was backed by binding enforcement powers of the UN Security Council, which were lacking in its predecessor, the League of Nations Council. All the great powers were also included in the United Nations, unlike the League, where powerful non-member states ran amok, including fascist Germany and Italy, militarist Japan, and the communist Soviet Union. Respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other countries is the legal and moral foundation of the long relative peace that the world has enjoyed for the past 75, 80 years, and along with decolonisation, fundamentally transformed the international order. All of this is progress, even if we know internal violence nonetheless escalated after 1945, and the Charter hasn't sufficiently addressed international economic coercion and imperialism by other means. Now, of course, historical perspective is cold comfort to Ukraine under fire. What is more encouraging is the effort by large parts of the international community to enforce international law using the wide range of legal tools available. In the absence of any global police or universal enforcement machinery, international law is implemented in multi-layered and decentralised ways by a multitude of actors. The methods of securing compliance have grown in number, breadth, and communication and sophistication over the past 75 years. At the international level, Russia has been repeatedly condemned for aggression by 3/4 of the member states of the General Assembly, which provides a good barometer of global opinion. The world has rejected Russia's spurious justifications for war, including that it's countering genocide or Nazism, protecting Russian nationals or the separatist so-called republics, or preventing NATO aggression. The UN has also suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council and the Council of Europe and demanded Russia pay reparations for the damage it caused. Multiple cases are underway at the International Court of Justice, and there are 10 cases before the European Court of Human Rights. The International Criminal Court and the UN Commission of Inquiry are investigating international crimes and violations of human rights. All of these steps delegitimise and isolate Russia, even if they alone cannot compel Russia to withdraw. There has also been a swift and effective humanitarian and refugee response and efforts to stabilise agricultural exports and world food security. At the national level, Russia has been met with heavy economic sanctions, which have inflicted significant stress on the Russian economy and disrupted its replenishment of its war machine. Added to this is voluntary divestment from the Russian economy by many large multinational companies. War crimes investigations are underway in Ukraine with foreign cooperation and through universal jurisdiction in foreign courts. Ukraine's international right of self-defense includes the right to request foreign assistance to repel Russia. Many Western states, including Australia, are heeding the call by lawfully providing heavy military weapons and ammunition and even tactical intelligence on Russian targets. All of this international assistance has assisted Ukraine to weather Russia's attack. Now, this extraordinary, almost textbook legal response to Russian aggression is justified by the scale of the crisis. Great power aggression to conquer territory, 1/3 of Ukraine's population of almost 40 million displaced from their homes, and 5 million refugees abroad, 15 million in need of humanitarian assistance, and at least 50,000 civilians killed or injured. In just a few years, Ukrainian military casualties are at least as high as the 58,000 Americans who died in 2 decades in Vietnam, or the 70,000 Afghan security forces killed in the 2 decades after 9/11. On the Russian side, and 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have probably been wounded. Russian casualties number at least 600,000 killed or injured. Now, that more is not being done to stop Russia, in my view, is largely a political, not a legal problem. Only about 34 countries have provided any military aid to Ukraine at all, only 17% of countries in the world. Further, the law allows foreign countries to throw their own forces into battle against Russia or to close the skies against Russian aircraft, but no one is willing to do this, unlike in the first Gulf War when a US-led coalition repelled Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. Nuclear weapons are not universally banned under international law, and as long as they exist, they will powerfully deter those contemplating using force against states that possess them, although views do differ on whether Russia would really use them, with red line after red line crossed without further escalation by Russia, and in so doing risk the likely destruction of Putin's own regime. Australia too is not amongst the 167 countries that have signed the 27 treaty to ban nuclear weapons completely, and relies on the US nuclear umbrella for our defence, which paradoxically might make us more insecure and more of a target. There's also little appetite after Iraq and Afghanistan to put boots on the ground in new foreign wars. The tension in the UN collective security system is that it relies on an idealistic vision of international solidarity, that law-abiding and peace-loving countries will come to the mutual defence of any threatened country, not only close allies as under the NATO or ANZUS treaties. It asks a lot. Why should a single Australian soldier die to save Ukrainians from Russia if it does not serve our direct interests? Would any of us seriously consider volunteering to fight in Ukraine against Russia? Now, one answer is that all countries have a core national interest in mutual self-defence, if the day ever comes when we ourselves are threatened, and we hope that someone answers our call, particularly if the US cannot be relied upon. Collective self-defence is also about deterrence. We didn't defend Ukraine in 2014 when Russia swallowed Crimea, and look what happened next. The weaker the legal order becomes, the greater the risk of lawlessness becoming contagious and the order we take for granted unravelling. Maintaining peace against predatory states is a burden all countries should share, particularly those with the greatest capacities. Sanctions not being stronger or broader is likewise due to the thresholds of economic and political pain that governments are willing to bear, not due to any legal limits. About 45 countries, a quarter of the world, have imposed any kind of sanctions on Russia at all. It's troubling that most non-Western states throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, a global majority, are not willing to impose sanctions at all. These include large democracies like India, Bangladesh, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa. Some are even taking advantage of cut-price Russian oil and gas deals, undermining the sanctions of others, or are prioritising their military and trade links with Russia. Fewer than 100 states voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council or to affirm Russia's duty to pay compensation for war damage. These countries erode the capacity of international law to credibly constrain aggressors. They also freeload off the international security system, expecting to benefit from the ban on military force without shouldering any burden to maintain it. Simply calling for negotiations, as some states do, is also unconscionable, because this inevitably expects the victim of aggression to make territorial concessions in violation of international law. And the modern law insists that Ukraine should not be pressured to give an inch of its territory. With the change of administration in the United States, this is a path, unfortunately, that the Trump administration, through its transactional deal-making, seems to be pushing Ukraine towards. The Security Council's paralysis due to Russia's veto does not preclude the right of states to collectively defend Ukraine or unilaterally impose sanctions. To be sure, the veto on the Security Council is a curse, but in its historical perspective was also something of a blessing. Giving the permanent 5 members the discretion to act or to block action was the price the world had to pay for the great powers to agree not only to be in the UN at all, but to agree to be responsible for providing and financing the global public good of peace and security. Now, their selective provision or failure to provide security now, of course, damages international law's legitimacy, but having no entity capable of ever providing it would, to be sure, be worse. It's hard to imagine the great powers willingly surrendering their veto in our lifetime, absent some seismic event like a world war. There's also no legal prospect of removing Russia from the Security Council. It is perverse that global security today relies on 5 countries that happened to win a war 80 years ago. The permanent members should be scorned whenever they arbitrarily exercise their veto and shamed into faithfully discharging their responsibilities. The world has also failed to create a much-discussed special tribunal to prosecute Putin and other leaders for the international crime of aggression. The ghost of the Iraq War in 2003 looms large. Recall that the UK Attorney General then advised the Blair government that the invasion could constitute the international crime of aggression, the same crime for which we executed German and Japanese leaders in the Second World War. Some Western states are uneasy about criminal liability for aggression. Australia, too, is not a party to the amendment to the International Criminal Court statute, which makes it a crime. While Putin is rightly seen as a pariah for committing aggression, Western leaders like Bush, Blair, and Howard are fated as benign elder statesmen. Many states from the global south rightly see double standards in judging Russia for aggression, but not the West or Israel for their violations. This also helps to explain why many states outside the West are in general less committed to Ukraine's cause than we are. Now, moving to the second part. Legal solidarity with Ukraine is just and necessary, and more should be done by more countries. But the relatively muscular international response to Russia exposes Western self-interest and double standards in not enforcing international law elsewhere. Western disrespect for international law has influenced Russia's belief that power trumps law, as well as the view of many non-Western states that they should put self-interest ahead of enforcing the law against violators like Russia. The US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 shattered the most fundamental rule of world order, the prohibition on the use of force. It was backed by another permanent member of the Security Council, the United Kingdom, and democracies like Australia. It followed the earlier lawless shock of the NATO humanitarian intervention in Kosovo in 1999, leading to its de facto forcible separation from Yugoslav sovereignty. These rule-breaking precedents and the impunity that followed reverberated from Moscow to Beijing and beyond. There are many other stark examples where the West or its allies have used or encouraged or tolerated illegal military force. Just as Russia has illegally annexed Crimea, Morocco annexed Western Sahara, Israel annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and the United Kingdom until very recently maintained illegal colonial rule over Mauritius's Chagos Islands. The International Court of Justice has ruled all of these situations to be illegal, and yet the United States has accepted the territorial claims of others over those territories. France even recently endorsed Morocco's autonomy plan to retain and annex Western Sahara on the acquisition of territory by force. For more than 2 decades, Australia recognised Indonesia's illegal annexation of East Timor until it was forced by a humanitarian crisis on its doorstep to return to the fold of international law. But even then, it refused to recognise Timor's rightful maritime claims for many years. It even convicted one person and attempted to prosecute another for exposing Australian economic cheating in the resource negotiations with one of the world's poorest countries. In the global war on terror, the United States has used military force from drones to special forces in dubious legal circumstances on many occasions in many countries. Most recently, the US and Israel, endorsed by Australia to my great concern, illegally and preventively bombed Iran's nuclear program. This month, the United States murdered 14 alleged narco-terrorists aboard 2 civilian vessels in international waters. Western states have not protested, as Israel has conducted over 400 preventive military strikes on targets in Syria, both to disarm preventively the Syrian government in case one day it might want to fight a war against Israel, even though this does not fit at all within our paradigm of self-defense. While Saudi Arabia was rightly lambasted for assassinating journalist Jamal Khashoggi, there was scarcely a murmur, as Israel has conducted numerous assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, not lawful military targets, over the past decade. Just in recent weeks, Israel murdered Hamas leaders gathered for peace talks in Qatar, an attack miraculously condemned by the Security Council. The United States has been loosely talking of taking over Gaza, Panama, Greenland, and so on. Now, these are examples of hypocrisy, not only in relation to the prohibition on military force or acquiring foreign territory by force, and then only in recent memory. The legacy of illegal Western violence during the Cold War and decolonisation is another story, from coups and interventions in Latin America, napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam, or carpet bombing of civilians in Laos and Cambodia. As Russia threatens to use nuclear weapons, recall the United States is the only country to have ever actually used them to deliberately kill large numbers of civilians to force Japan to surrender. I'll never forget meeting a survivor from Hiroshima, a young girl in 1945, who described the horror of seeing her own skin hanging in shreds from her body. There are also flagrant recent Western violations of other fundamental rules of international law, human rights, humanitarian law. During the war on terror, the US government abducted, tortured, indefinitely detained, unfairly tried, and even murdered some terrorist suspects. Yet accountability is largely absent. Given its preeminence, US impunity signals to other countries that lawlessness and international crimes are acceptable while countering terrorism, or when the government thinks the chips are down. The United States has shown similar hostility to international accountability that Russia is showing. It's long opposed and actively undermined the International Criminal Court, including imposing sanctions on its judges and prosecutors. It withdrew entirely from the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction when it lost the case to Nicaragua in 1986, after the court found the US had been illegally using military force against that democracy. It routinely condemns the United Nations for daring to criticise it or its allies, and has now defunded large parts of the system. The United States comes second only to Russia in the most vetoes of Security Council resolution, well ahead of China. An exceptionalist United States refuses to become a party to many of the world's most basic and widely subscribed human rights treaties, including on the rights of women, children, persons with disabilities, against forced disappearances, economic, social, cultural rights. It's not a party to treaties banning terrible weapons like landmines and cluster munitions. It won't even join the quasi-constitutional Convention on the Law of the Sea, despite condemning China for violating that treaty in the South China Sea. It has crippled the World Trade Organization appeal system by vetoing the appointment of new judges for many years. and now has launched a full frontal attack on the global free trade system through protectionist and unlawful tariffs. So, thirdly, the intergenerational conflict in Israel and Palestine draws together many of the above threads in a totemic example of Western hypocrisy and the dysfunction and tantalizing promise of international law. The dispute has run for over a century. The latest violence in Israel and Gaza is horrific, both in the methods and scale of suffering. Hamas's 7 October attack killed over 1,200 Israelis and foreigners, wounded 3,000, took up to 250 hostages. The attack involved war crimes and crimes against humanity, murder, attacking civilians, hostage taking, arbitrary detention, torture, mutilation, sexual violence, in addition to indiscriminate rocket attacks on civilians. The vengeful Israeli response has killed or injured well over 200,000 people, almost 10% of the population of Gaza. Most of them are civilians. It's also damaged 80% of Gaza's housing and decimated much public infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, water and sanitation, the food system, businesses, and destroyed the financial system. Rebuilding Gaza could cost well in excess of $80 billion. In the process, there's credible evidence of alleged Israeli violations of international humanitarian law, including denial of humanitarian relief, starvation, extermination of civilians, murder, attacks on civilians, indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks on civilians, including through the frequent use of high explosive weapons in densely populated urban areas, willfully causing great suffering, cruel treatment, persecution, and other inhumane acts. Israel has also failed to fulfill its governance and law and order obligations as the occupying power. In the occupied West Bank, there's been an increasing, exploding settler and military violence, including forced evictions. In total, almost 10,000 Palestinians are held in Israeli prisons or in ad hoc military facilities, many arbitrarily, with over 50 people having died due to inhumane conditions and ill treatment. Now, as in relation to Ukraine, there has been an impressive mobilization of international legal tools to address violations. The International Criminal Court prosecutor has sought arrest warrants for Hamas and Israeli leaders. States have sought to halt alleged genocide at the International Court of Justice. The Security Council, tepidly, admittedly, demanded a ceasefire and sought to facilitate humanitarian relief. Most countries have halted arms exports to Israel. In recent months, even Germany, the second largest exporter to Israel, given the clear risk of the use of those weapons and munitions in violations of humanitarian law. There's a groundswell of public sympathy in many countries for the victims and the mobilization of social protest movements against Israeli violations, despite intense media partisanship and political polarization in some countries. The UK government even banned the protest group Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, a ban we're challenging currently in the UK courts, while the US has listed leading Palestinian human rights groups as terrorist organisations. Yet there are also many differences from the robust Western response to Ukraine. Despite some criticism of Israel's conduct, the US has remained its protector-in-chief. It continues to export weapons and provide military aid. It largely shields Israel from serious criticism or action by the Security Council. It's refused to impose sanctions, with the exception of sanctions on a few extremist settlers. It attacks the International Criminal Court. It's largely ignored the authoritative findings of the successive advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice. Its criticism of illegal settlements is either muted or usually without consequence. It explicitly accepts Israel's unlawful annexation of East Jerusalem and seems to be moving towards accepting further annexation in the West Bank and possibly even Gaza. It supports a politically negotiated settlement without adequate regard for the red lines imposed by international law, which is, by the way, the reason why successive Palestinian leaders have always accepted the deals put on the table by Israel, because none of them have satisfied the requirements of international law. The US insists on negotiation between grossly unequal parties, only one of whom is supported in a highly partisan manner by the United States. how can the US be an honest broker in that context? Domestically, a new McCarthyism against peaceful Palestinian protest and speech has taken hold in some quarters, including university campuses. Now, the current cycle of violence is just one part of this century of conflict. As the UN Secretary General correctly observed, Hamas's attack did not happen in a vacuum, but is obviously connected with long-standing and legitimate Palestinian grievances. The United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy of 2006, adopted by consensus of all countries, including Israel, urges all countries to address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, which is like UN jargon for root causes of violence. The strategy says these conditions include, quote, prolonged unresolved conflicts, dehumanization of victims, lack of rule of law, violations of human rights, ethnic, national and religious discrimination, political exclusion, socioeconomic marginalization and lack of good governance. Now, all of these factors are present in Israeli-occupied Palestine for many, many decades. And so no surprises that the failure to address these causes generates grievances, resistance, and a pathway to radical violence. Now, the global strategy declares that conditions conducive to terrorism, of course, cannot excuse or justify terrorism, but they still must be addressed. They're not deterministic root causes. People ultimately choose to resort to violence, and they choose the methods of violence. But these conditions conducive are not irrelevant if your concern is to ameliorate the perpetuation of violence. Now, in July last year, the ICJ advisory opinion on the Israeli occupation identifies many of the violations underlying the present conflict. Illegal annexation of Palestinian territory, a violation of the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force, denial of self-determination, violations of the law of occupation and human rights law through illegal settlements, 700,000 settlers now in the West Bank, a systematic illegal exploitation of Palestinian resources, illegal land confiscations and evictions, refusal to return land belonging to Palestinians, and a violation of the prohibition against racial segregation and apartheid. Now, the court found that Israel is required to provide full reparation for its wrongful acts, including restitution and compensation. It also emphasised that all other countries have obligations not to recognise any of these illegal situations and not to provide aid or assistance to maintain Israel's illegal presence. Now, of course, other factors played a role in October 7th, including extremist ideologies and anti-Semitism. Israel has legitimate security concerns that must be addressed, although not at any price and not in the manner so far that has never ensured Israel's long-term security. You only have to listen to generations of retired Israeli security officials to know that the worst thing for securing peace and security in Israel is to maintain the occupation. This is a political choice, not a choice by seasoned and serious security people. Tellingly, Hamas did not exist before the Israeli occupation of 1967. It was born and radicalized in the protracted failures to settle the dispute according to law and justice, and the multi-generational human suffering, humiliation, lack of opportunity, hopelessness and powerlessness that this has inflicted on Palestinians. Given Israel's lack of a credible post-war plan for Gaza and Palestine, and US's deference to Israel, the mistakes, injustice and trauma of the past century look set to continue, unless the severity of the current crisis forces greater introspection and a rupture from the status quo of accepting indefinite Israeli occupation and creeping annexation. There are some signs of hope. With more European countries, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia moving recently to recognise Palestine as a state. The United States and a dwindling group of states still refuse to recognise statehood, but about 147, 49 countries, over 75% of the world, now recognise it. That's more than recognised, by the way, Western-backed Kosovo, 115, or Taiwan, 0. Less promising, and yet we are militarily proposing to defend it, which also raises some pretty interesting legal questions. Less promising is the fact that so few states have imposed more targeted, concrete measures on Israel, namely sanctions. Very few countries have imposed any sanctions at all. Most have imposed them only on a couple of far-right settlers or some extreme right members of cabinet. That's the Australian approach. And it was pleasing to see today that the European Union is proposing to impose some stronger sanctions on Israel. Without a step change, injustice and perceptions of injustice will remain key drivers in radicalisation, violent extremism, and terrorism, causing insecurity for Israelis and Palestinians alike, and contaminating international relations within and beyond the region. The current excessive response by Israel, like much of the US overreaction after 9/11, may have, as the previous US Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, warned, a generational impact on terrorist recruitment. It's also contributing to the perception of the breakdown of international law, where a few select states seem to be above the law. Decades of impunity for Israel have emboldened it to get to the point where we are today in Gaza, because if it feels there are no constraints, then it becomes ever more radical in the responses, as we've seen with Israel's widening circle of violence across many countries in the region in the last 2 years. Finally, to draw some threads together by way of conclusion, the dispiriting truth is that Western states often contemptuously abuse international law, despite all of their talk of a rules-based international order. The West weaponises international law in pursuit of its own political ends, like so many other countries do, and as a cudgel against its adversaries. Or it ignores the law when it gets in the way of the US or allied interests, knowing that geopolitical power confers impunity from enforcement. Western selectivity signals that international law is not law at all, just a smokescreen for power. Despite not practicing what it preaches, the West then seems surprised when its lectures about a rules-based order fall on deaf ears, or when non-Western states do not rally to its cause in Ukraine. The West's attitude weakens respect for rules everywhere. It invites other countries to play the same legal game. It's no accident that Russia has cloaked its invasion in concocted legal justifications like self-defense, preventing genocide, or protecting Russian nationals. This is the same strategy some Western states have used to justify their legal activities. They've learned from the West, Iraq, Kosovo, Guantanamo Bay, Palestine, the list goes on. As power shifts to Asia, China too has learned from us that power lets you create rules to suit yourself and bend or ignore rules that don't. All breaches of fundamental international rules without consequence weaken the international order, respect for it, and the deterrent value of the rules to future aggressors. The stark contradictions between US and Western approaches to Ukraine and Gaza are also eroding confidence in the universal values championed by the post-war multilateral order at a time when geopolitical power is shifting and transactional, non-ideological alliances are growing. It's part of a larger critique unfolding about who shapes international rules and selects the causes that matter to global order. As India's External Affairs Minister recently put it, somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. Why should Pacific states, for example, care about European and US concerns in Ukraine when the West does not seemingly care enough about their concerns for a fairer economic order, to address the effects of climate change, to address trade and debt and development questions? Now, none of this is to suggest that certain non-Western countries would necessarily respect international law if Western powers did, but it would certainly increase the global social pressure to conform to the rules. It would raise the political and economic costs of violations and likely induce more compliance than at present. Even the most powerful countries are sensitive to their international reputations and the material harm to their interests that can flow from serious reputational damage. The job of international law and international lawyers and those who support it is to continuously raise the price of non-compliance. Now, international law will always be hostage to power and self-interest. It's a decentralized and imperfect legal system. It's created by countries in part to serve their interests. It lacks a global police to compel obedience. It relies on countries acting in good faith, doing the right thing, pressuring other countries to uphold their legal bargains. Compliance is most difficult, as Morgenthau mentioned, in the realm of high politics and national security. Critical gaps and deficiencies in the international rule of law are likely to remain, given the nature of the legal personality of sovereign states, and given that too few states are willing to cede more sovereignty to international enforcement or dispute settlement, and prefer to preserve political latitude to act in domestic and international affairs. It's sadly true that most international crimes will never be punished. We also have to be realistic about what even advanced and well-functioning legal systems can achieve, because we often criticise international law for not being up to scratch and not doing what we hope of it. But many domestic legal systems, law enforcement is weak, selective, arbitrary, corrupt, ineffective. Even in incredibly strong systems like Australia, non-compliance with law is endemic and may meet limited tokenistic or arbitrary enforcement. Consider, for example, the millions of daily but unpunished breaches of public health restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. That almost 80% of Australian drivers admit to breaking the speed limit, and most are never caught. The prevalence of tax evasion, the minuscule chance that victims of sexual assault will ever get justice in the Australian legal system, or the drastic difference in access to justice due to economic inequalities. All of this is a problem of law and social life and politics in general, not just of international law. Even when strong norms have been agreed or strong institutions established, they'll only ever be as strong as the political and social customs in which they are embedded. Law has no autonomous magic power, as numerous coups in many domestic legal systems demonstrate. Judges cannot stop governments of gunmen, even if they possess ostensibly binding power to enforce laws under the Constitution. In this sense, international law has proved more stable, actually, and more law-like than many national legal orders, very few of which look as stable over time as a system like Australia's. Taking a long view of history, swings between realist and more cosmopolitan views of what to expect from international order are cyclical. A spirit of humanitarianism, pacifism, multilateralism arose in the Hague conferences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before being cut down by the First World War. In turn, that war was followed by President Woodrow Wilson's ambitious liberal internationalism, putting aside his views on race, culminating in the establishment of the League of Nations, an early principle of self-determination, a prohibition on the use of force, a permanent court of international justice. The Second World War destroyed those structures, but the ideas lived on, crystallized, became stronger in the post-war peace, security, prosperity and human rights architecture of the United Nations. The onset of the Cold War and UN paralysis signaled a turn to realism, led US scholars in particular to characterize the international system as an anarchic theater of conflict where law merely reflects but does not otherwise constrain power unless the powerful desire. The end of the Cold War again challenged realist assumptions with a renewed liberal internationalism in a more active Security Council, a revival of international criminal justice, humanitarian intervention, and the creation of the World Trade System. Even then, this was hardly a high point, as the victims of the Rwandan genocide would attest. Now, as the euphoria of the end of history faded, since the 2000s, realism has revived. The death of the responsibility to protect, internationalism has been dampened by the illegal invasion of Iraq, renewed competition between the West and Russia and China, Russia's aggression, China's illegal maritime activities, the decline of the US, not willing to gently let go of its dominance, and now a global schism over Palestine that embodies many other extraneous frustrations and fault lines about the nature of international order. We are at a particularly low point, perhaps the early rather than the late 19th crisis that breaks it. States return time and time again to the project of international law in the hope of picking up the pieces and doing better next time. International law appeals to radically different political orders to peacefully manage radical disagreements, and for good reasons. States are attracted to it because it offers reasons for compliance through consent, self-interest, reciprocity, cooperation and coordination, stability, efficiency, alignment with values, the prospect of peace, prosperity, and a certain moral appeal as well. I remain inspired, despite this gloomy picture that I've painted. I do remain inspired by the many diplomats I encounter every week, government officials, civil society groups, social movements globally, United Nations officials, academics, others who work tirelessly every day still to build a stronger international system and to hold the powerful to account, despite the seeming odds. Many try to raise awareness of the many conflicts the media do not well report on, from Sudan to Myanmar to Congo to Somalia, as well as the everyday violations of human rights in so many countries that are usually invisible. I've met many champions of change even within populist or authoritarian governments who look to international law and institutions for support, not for surrender to capricious power. Countries like Australia need to play a stronger leadership role and build coalitions of like-minded states to promote human rights, peacemaking, and multilateralism. Australia is the world's 13th largest economy, more than a self-effacing middle power that it often says it is. If we don't step up in a world where democracy is an increasingly endangered species, perhaps 25 countries are fully democratic today, the question is, who will step up? We also need to enhance our funding of the international system, particularly human rights, humanitarian and development assistance, peacekeeping, and so on. Only with less selectivity and more consistency and accountability will international law no longer languish as imperial power masquerading as law, but fulfill its promise as a genuine means of holding states to the rules they created and pledged to obey. If we expect others to be law-abiding, whether Russia or China or Israel, we must also look in the mirror. Thank you.
I have the very difficult task of running questions and answers when what's on the table is the collapse of the world. And we have only 10-15 minutes for it. We have this system then, people submitting questions, and there are many there. And that goes from, we have black spots in your talk, Sudan, Myanmar, Cambodia, Thailand, and we're going to continue. The list is endless, but you at the end touched on it, that the emphasis that you put on Ukraine and Palestine is just two kind of visible examples of a world that is truly in convulsion. And I think for better or worse, for people that, like myself, do international law, it is like a festival of problems, and everything somehow is related to international law. So it's very hard to do a selection. So questions reflect that kind of widespread concerns or what's going on. I would like to start with one question that cuts across many of the concerns that I expressed on the chat, and is institutions. So you have taken the decision to embrace international law as most of all an institutional machinery. And it's an institutional machinery that is crumbling apart for many reasons. One of them is the withdrawal of the main funder from the main organization, the United Nations. One of the concerns then is what's spread at the moment is what to do. So what to do with the main organization that was set up in order to try to put together a wall after the First and Second World War. What we would like to see in terms of the United Nations, which is, by the way, in its 80th anniversary, and is reviewed as we speak. So from your mandate, what you would like to see next coming from the institution and these current reforms?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I mean, yeah, as you know, the Secretary General has a process called UN 80, which is a reform of the UN. Unfortunately, it's instead of being a kind of big picture strategic review of how to improve the UN, it's kind of descended into a bit of a, frankly, a cost-cutting exercise. I mean, and it's been launched in the last year of the Secretary General's term in office, which makes it impossible actually to carry those, those reforms through anyway. It's a tough climate because the UN is being forced to cut 20-30% of its budget and staff over the next sort of 6 months, 12 monts. So under those conditions, it's very difficult to embark on a kind of more radical, systematic reform that you might be able to do at a different moment in time. I mean, the big concern at the moment is that the UN's role in peace and security, peacekeeping, peace operations has just been increasingly marginalised in recent years. There's little the UN can do about this. I mean, look, the UN, since its inception, has been forced by great powers to constantly review itself, reform itself. It's pushed and shoved in different directions by different donor preferences. So that, in a sense, the UN, although it has some autonomy, it's hostage to states, and particularly very powerful, influential states who fund it. And so in that environment, the ball is in the court of states, right? I mean, if certain states are no longer funding, if they're drawing down their funding, the only solution is other states have to step up. And unfortunately, the opposite is happening. I mean, the US is cutting funding, but so too is the UK and a bunch of European states. And then a whole lot of others are just paying their dues at the end of the year, forcing the UN constantly into a liquidity crisis and not knowing from month to month if it can afford its staff, programs, etc. So, it does remind me a lot of the League of Nations, where by the end of the League, early on in the League, did actually quite well on peace and security, the 20s, and then as the 30s came on, it started kind of falling to pieces. But even up until the start of the war, the League of Nations, like the UN now, still doing amazing technical work in public health and women and minorities, and all of this rolls on. And this is the part of the UN that doesn't get a lot of credit and visibility, and is always overshadowed by why didn't you stop the war in Gaza or Ukraine? And it's like, well, the UN can't do that. I mean, member states have to do that. But this technical work by civil servants around the place is amazing. In fact, nobody, frankly, cares about, apart from people at UN human rights or civil society groups or those mobilizing on those issues. But that struggle for visibility and therefore for political solutions and funding is just so hard in so many places.
Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question then. Kind of to bring for you then on the electronic board here, about your mandate in particular. So you are the UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights. And it's an incredibly difficult mandate because you're trying to use international law that is, as we have heard, this old guy in the room that is quite resilient but has been in battle many, many times. It's the history of kind of trying to pick up and stand up on the face of successive collapses. But you're dealing with something called terrorism that changes constantly. On the one hand, it's misused constantly to label anything that presents as a security risk. But on the other hand, it is an activity that relies on all sorts of means in order to cause terror. So there's an interesting question here about what the future lies for your mandate when we have artificial intelligence, cybercrime, a much more transnationalized world in which terror doesn't take place in one location but can actually, kind of have effects that is responding to this changing nature of the needs of terror.
Yeah, it's a good question, and the terrorism and counterterrorism discourse has been constantly evolving since 9/11 and obviously before, but particularly accelerated post 9/11. A new language caught on of violent extremist civil society, political dissidents, journalists, minority groups, indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, the list, students, the list goes on and on. It's a technique of governance, it's a technique of control, which appeals to a lot of government, and not just non-Western governments. I mean, a lot of Western governments are getting in on this act as well. Technology, to go to the question, is part of both the terrorist and counter-terrorist side, I'd say. Because, yes, AI, etc., social media, proliferation of online terrorist content, violent extremist content, whatever that means, I still don't know, is absolutely exploding online, and the use of technologies by the state, spyware, facial recognition, software, artificial intelligence, is likewise exploding, again against dissidents as much as against actual terrorists. So we are releasing next month a paper on artificial intelligence, human rights, and counterterrorism to contribute to this debate, which is everywhere, but counterterrorism is part of that discourse as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ben. And just one last question. Here, everyone in the room that has been posting questions, they're excellent, but I just want to try to kind of grasp the vibe of some of them, which are around the question of what we can do. So, your intervention today was a really strong call of action to governments. Let's start kind of hiding this double standard talk. Let's face the challenge. Let's say what law is asking them to do for a long time. But there are many questions here about what about individuals and what about students? What about civil society organizations? What they can do in this moment where everything that seems to be, or the main actors that seem to act on behalf of the collective are being silent or being in these game of mirrors and double standards. So what is your position about that? And I'm just saying it as someone that feels very strong, for example, on the question of Ukraine, the question of Palestine, and that has been constantly moved by the civil society organizing themselves, constantly being on the streets, doing actions that government should do, but they don't do. So from your mandate, how important is that mobilization, and what you would like to see more if that's the case?
Yeah, I think Gaza is a great example, actually, because the incredible mobilization of civil society has absolutely shifted government opinion. On Palestinian statehood recognition by the Israeli government. This was something which had kind of been in the works for a very long time, and then 100,000 people get on Sydney Harbour Bridge, and then suddenly the time frame is dramatically moved up. It sent a very strong message to the Premier of New South Wales, who'd been cracking down on pro-Palestine protests for the last 2 years, for politicians to see just the power of the constituency that feels deeply about this. I think it's made a huge difference, it's not just getting out on the streets. There are lots of ways you can make a difference, but certainly in the work of my mandate, civil society is absolutely indispensable to everything we do. They're the ones who feed us information about political prisoners in Egypt, or the killing of Mapuche indigenous people in Argentina. It's a very interactive process, and one of the things we've been trying to do in the last 3-4 years at the UN side is to get UN security bodies to seriously engage with civil society, because it kind of replicates what often happens at the national level, because security agencies are secret, kind of, I mean, by nature they're secretive organizations. It's not like they consult with NGOs about what they do, right? But this kind of opening up, and it's worked surprisingly well. I mean, now the Security Council bodies have just recently adopted a civil society engagement policy. This is true of the UN Office of Counterterrorism as well. To try to promote the message that it's not only it improves policy outcomes, it can knock the rough edges off policies which would otherwise be counterproductive or lead to human rights violations. So you can demonstrate the value to security agencies as well. I mean, it's not just about the moral side or the protection of human rights. It's good security practice to engage communities deeply in what you're doing. The risk then is what we also see in a bunch of countries, which is governments instrumentalize civil society that they like to wheel out, for example, policies to prevent and counter violent extremism, but they absolutely don't want to talk to human rights advocacy protection organizations, which are, because they're exposing state violations. So, this civil society is everywhere in counterterrorism globally now, and there are, I'd have to say that one of the difficult things we're seeing recently is counterterrorism financing laws pushed by both the Security Council and the Financial Action Task Force, leading to massive overregulation of NGOs. Restrictions on their funding, registration, dissolution, because of this assumption that because you're an NGO, you must be at risk of financing terrorism. And no, that's absolutely not true for almost every NGO, but this fear of certain charities being abused by terrorists to raise funds has led to a system-wide crackdown on civil society. So lots of, I mean, the last 25 years of counterterrorism have in many ways improved our security, and that's good for protecting the right to life from terror, but it's had a lot of extremely negative consequences on human rights as well. In some cases where the risk of terrorism in a given country is very, very small, but the excessive use of counterterrorism policies has created, actually far more human rights violations.
Ben, thank you so much. On behalf of the International and Comparative Law Cluster, La Trobe Law School and La Trobe University, thank you so much for being with us. It is a pleasure to host UN Special Rapporteurs. This is the second one. Third is coming next year. I have the pleasure to announce that will be the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Professor Michael Fakri. All of you will hear in due course about the day, the venue, and everything that will be happening around this visit. Thank you so much for coming. Please join me in